Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. The air is thick with salt and gunpowder. A single cannon blast tears through the darkness, its echo rolling across the water like a warning shot to history itself. Fort Sumter is under fire. America is at war with itself. Soldiers scramble. Officers shout orders. Civilians wake in panic. By sunrise, the nation will be divided, families torn apart, and hundreds of thousands condemned to die. But far from the smoke and chaos of Charleston Harbor, something else is already in motion. Ledgers are opened. Contracts are drafted. Factories begin to hum. Before the first soldier falls, before the first grave is dug, money is already changing hands. This is where our story begins, not on the battlefield, but behind it. War has always been described as sacrifice, as duty, as a tragic necessity in defense of freedom. And yet, across American history, an unsettling paradox quietly repeats itself. While nations bleed, a small and remarkably consistent group prospers. Every war is called unique. Every conflict framed as unavoidable. Every generation told, this time is different. But when the smoke clears, the same names remain. The same families. The same corporations. The same balance sheets, larger than before. This documentary is not about conspiracy. It is about pattern. A pattern preserved in public records, government contracts, congressional hearings, and corporate archives. A pattern that raises a simple but disturbing question. How is it that every major American war, no matter the cause, the enemy, or the century, creates massive wealth for the same handful of dynasties? To understand this, we must go back not just to 1861, but to the very foundation of the American state. From a Revolutionary War onward, the young republic faced a problem it could not escape. War requires industry, weapons, fuel, financing, logistics. Governments fight wars, but they do not manufacture them alone. From the beginning, private enterprise stood beside public power. Gunpowder mills in Delaware, oil fields in Pennsylvania, banks in New York, shipyards, steel plants, railroads, refineries. Each conflict expanded the relationship between government and industry, tightening it, formalizing it, institutionalizing it. What began as temporary necessity slowly hardened into permanent structure. By the 20th century, war was no longer just an event. It was a system. As the United States industrialized, war itself became industrial. World War I transformed factories into weapons pipelines. World War II perfected mass production of destruction. The Cold War normalized perpetual readiness. And the War on Terror erased the idea of an endpoint entirely. Through all of it, certain families learned something crucial, something more valuable than military strategy. They learned how to position themselves before wars began. They learned how to embed themselves so deeply into national defense that removing them became impossible. And they learned how to convert temporary emergencies into generational wealth. These were not accidents. They were innovations. Names like DuPont, Rockefeller, Morgan, Lockheed, and Halliburton appear again and again, not as footnotes, but as pillars. They supplied gunpowder when armies mobilized, fuel when tanks rolled, loans when governments ran dry, aircraft when wars moved to the sky, logistics when conflicts stretched across continents. Each war strengthened their role. Each crisis expanded their influence. Each generation inherited not just money, but access. Access to lawmakers. Access to regulators. Access to the machinery of war itself. Over time, a new reality emerged. Wars could be lost, but contracts endured. Presidents changed, but suppliers remained. Ideologies collapsed, but balance sheets survived. This story is not about villains in smoke-filled rooms. It is about incentives. It is about systems that reward preparation for conflict rather than prevention of it. It is about mechanisms quietly written into policy, cost-plus contracts that guarantee profit regardless of overruns. No-bid emergency agreements justified by national security. The revolving door between generals and corporate boardrooms. Lobbying networks that shape not just laws, but narratives. Together, these mechanisms form something rarely discussed openly. A war economy that does not depend on victory, only continuity. By the time the first bombs fall, the outcome is already partially decided. Not on the battlefield, but in procurement offices, in congressional committees, in corporate planning rooms where war is modeled not as tragedy, but as demand. This does not mean wars are staged for profit. It means that once war becomes inevitable, profit is systematically extracted from it. And over decades, extraction becomes expectation. As we move through this documentary, we will follow this pattern across centuries. From black powder to jet engines, from muskets to drones, from national defense to global intervention. We will trace how 5 families, through foresight, proximity to power, and structural advantage, turned war into an inheritance. Not once, not occasionally, but consistently. And as we do, another question will emerge, one that lingers long after the final credits roll. If war has become profitable, who truly benefits from peace? By the time the smoke clears on any battlefield, the story of the war has already been written somewhere else. Not in trenches, not in foxholes, but in contracts, invoices, and balance sheets. To understand how war became profitable, not once, but repeatedly, we must follow the money across time, conflict by conflict, generation by generation. What emerges is not chaos, but structure. The first lesson. The Revolutionary War, the American Revolutionary War, is remembered as a struggle against empire. What it also created was a blueprint. The Continental Army lacked weapons, ammunition, and supplies. The new government lacked manufacturing capacity. Private industry filled the gap. One company stood above the rest, DuPont. Founded in 1802, DuPont quickly became the nation's largest gunpowder producer. By the War of 1812, it supplied more than half of all American gunpowder. The lesson was simple and enduring. If you control the supply of war, you control the terms. DuPont learned to scale production during peacetime, positioning itself as indispensable before conflict erupted. When war arrived, competitors could not catch up. This would become step 1 of the war profit pattern. 2. The Civil War. War goes industrial. The American Civil War marked a turning point. This was not a small professional conflict. It was total war. Over 4 million pounds of DuPont gunpowder were sold during the conflict. The company earned roughly $10 million, nearly $300 million in today's dollars. But the real gain was not profit. It was permanence. DuPont used war earnings to expand into chemicals, explosives, and industrial research, transforming from a wartime supplier into a peacetime giant. At the same time, another dynasty emerged. John D. Rockefeller. Oil replaced gunpowder as the lifeblood of modern warfare. Trains, ships, factories, and later vehicles all ran on fuel. Standard Oil dominated refining, transport, and pricing. Rockefeller didn't need to fight wars. He needed wars to move. 3. Financing war. The Morgan model weapons and fuel alone do not sustain war. War requires credit. Enter J.P. Morgan. By the late 19th century, Morgan's banks had mastered war financing, issuing loans to governments that could not afford prolonged conflict. During World War I, Morgan arranged more than $2 billion in loans to Britain and France. The implication was profound. If the Allies lost, those loans would default. American neutrality suddenly became financially dangerous. Senator George Norris would later say, "We are going into war upon the command of gold." War financing created step 2 of the pattern. Once capital is invested, political outcomes follow. For World War I, the contract ERA begins. World War I normalized something new, government contracting at scale. Emergency powers bypassed competitive bidding. Suppliers were chosen for speed, not scrutiny. This is where step 3 emerged. Cost plus contracts. Under this model, contractors were reimbursed for all expenses, plus a guaranteed profit percentage. The result? There was no incentive to control costs. In fact, higher costs meant higher profits. War had become mathematically profitable. World War II. The permanent war economy. World War II was the most expensive conflict in human history. It also permanently fused government and industry. Aircraft manufacturers exploded in size. Shipyards multiplied. Chemical, steel, and oil production surged. Companies that mastered wartime production were rewarded with long-term government dependency. This era birthed what President Eisenhower would later call the military-industrial complex. But the system did not dissolve after victory. It stabilized. War became preparation for the next war. 6. Aviation and Lockheed enters modern warfare, moved upward into the sky. Aircraft became the ultimate weapon. And aircraft manufacturing became too complex, too expensive, and too specialized to replace. This created Step 4. Lock-in. Once a weapon system was selected, cancellation became politically and financially impossible. Lockheed mastered this. The C-5 Galaxy transport plane began as a $2.1 billion contract. Final cost, $5.3 billion. Under cost-plus terms, overruns increased profits. Failure was profitable. 7. The revolving door. Power recycled by the Cold War. The pattern refined itself. Generals approved weapon systems. Retired generals joined defense boards. Executives advised policymakers. Policymakers approved more weapons. This was Step 5. Hire the regulators. Oversight became symbolic. Accountability became negotiable. The same individuals moved between public duty and private profit, carrying influence with them. 8. Lobbying war. Selling necessity. Wars required justification. This introduced Step 6. Manufacture consent. Defense contractors funded think tanks, policy institutes, and advisory boards. These institutions produced white papers, threat assessments, and strategic forecasts. Intervention became recommendation. Recommendation became policy. By the time wars were debated publicly, the intellectual groundwork had already been laid. 9. Halliburton and the War on Terror. The War on Terror removed the final limitation. Time. No defined enemy. No geographic boundary. No end date. Halliburton thrived in this environment. Through its subsidiary KBR, the company received more than $40 billion in Iraq contracts, many without competitive bidding. Pentagon Inspector General reports documented billions in waste. Fuel not delivered, meals not served, construction never completed. Fines were paid. Contracts continued. This revealed Step 7. Consequences do not threaten the system. Only disruption does. The modern state. War AS budget. By 2023, the U.S. military budget reached $816 billion. The top 5 contractors absorbed roughly 25% of it. Lockheed Martin alone earned $65 billion, 90% from government contracts. These companies no longer react to war. They plan around it. Their shareholders expect it. Their supply chains depend on it. Their valuations assume it. War has become forecastable revenue. 11. The pattern, complete across centuries. The same structure repeats. Position before war. Secure early contracts. Lock in cost-plus pricing. Overrun budgets. Rotate power. Influence intervention. Convert profits into dynasties. This is not ideology. It is architecture. Built slowly. Reinforced constantly. Rarely questioned. War ends for nations. For profiteers, it compounds. When wars end, history tells us to look for heroes. The generals who commanded. The soldiers who sacrificed. The flags raised. The treaties signed. But rarely do we ask a quieter question. Who stayed when the war was over? Because while armies demobilize and nations mourn, certain institutions remain exactly where they were, waiting. Waiting for the next emergency, the next authorization, the next justification. Across more than 2 centuries of American conflict, the names have changed slightly, the weapons have evolved, and the enemies have shifted. But the structure has not. What began as necessity slowly became normalization. At first, private industry filled gaps the government could not. Then it expanded faster than the government itself. Eventually, it embedded so deeply that separating public defense from private profit became unthinkable. War did not corrupt the system. It revealed what the system rewarded: preparedness over prevention, scale over restraint, continuity over resolution. In this architecture, peace is not failure, but it is interruption. The 5 families we followed did not need to conspire. They needed only to understand incentives. They positioned themselves early, expanded patiently, and aligned their fortunes with national emergencies. They learned that wars are unpredictable, but defense spending is not. And once a system proves reliable, it does not disappear. It institutionalizes. Consider the paradox at the heart of modern warfare. Wars are presented as extraordinary events, yet the machinery that supports them is permanent. Factories never shut down. Contracts roll forward. Budgets renew annually. Lobbying never pauses. The weapon systems may change, but the business model persists. Even when wars are unpopular, even when outcomes are uncertain, even when objectives remain undefined. Especially then, the most profound transformation was not technological. It was philosophical. War stopped being a temporary mobilization and became a standing condition. A condition justified by deterrence, by readiness, by security. Each conflict left behind infrastructure, not just military bases, but legal frameworks, procurement pipelines, and financial expectations. These frameworks outlast presidents. They outlast ideologies. They outlast public attention. And so, every generation inherits not just history, but obligation. Obligation to maintain readiness, to justify expenditure, to defend prior investments. Once billions are committed, cancellation becomes unthinkable. Once jobs depend on contracts, opposition becomes political risk. Once entire regions rely on defense manufacturing, war spending becomes economic policy. The system does not demand war, but it benefits from it. The cost of the system is rarely measured only in dollars. It is measured in opportunity, in schools not built, in infrastructure deferred, in healthcare postponed, in research unfunded. Every budget is a choice. And when war becomes predictable spending, alternatives become optional. None of this erases genuine threats. None of this denies real dangers. But it reframes the conversation. It asks whether perpetual preparation has replaced genuine security, whether profit has become indistinguishable from protection, whether the line between defense and dependency has already been crossed. Perhaps the most unsettling realization is this: no single decision created this system. No single leader controls it. It evolved gradually, rationally, legally. It grew because it worked. And because it worked, it was never dismantled. The families at the center of this story did not merely survive history. They adapted to it. They turned volatility into stability, uncertainty into revenue, crisis into inheritance, war after war, generation after generation. So the final question is not whether war profiteering exists. The record answers that clearly. The real question is whether a system built on perpetual readiness can ever truly value peace. Because peace, in this architecture, produces no surge in demand, no emergency contracts, no justification for expansion. Peace asks for restraint, and restraint isn't profitable. As new conflicts emerge and old ones refuse to end, the machinery hums on, quiet, efficient, prepared. Factories remain ready. Think tanks stay funded. Lobbyists stay active. Contracts await signatures. The battlefield may change. The pattern does not. History teaches us that empires fall not only from invasion, but from imbalance, from systems that serve themselves too well, from incentives that outgrow accountability, from structures that mistake permanence for necessity. And so, as this story closes, it leaves us not with accusation, but with awareness. Because systems persist only when they are unseen. And once seen, they can be questioned. Not emotionally, not ideologically, but structurally. War ends for nations. For profiteers, it becomes legacy. The question now is not who benefited from the last war, but whether the next one is already being prepared.